This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy. Chapter 5. Roman Gold Substitute. War Borrowing. Men seldom go into debt freely. We have seen how the system demands that new money be borrowed into existence in order to pay 11 for 10 when only 10 exists. This will work for that class of citizen who is always in debt, but it will not do for that solid type of citizen who for business or religious reasons will not borrow or go into debt. This type of individual must be forced to borrow new money into existence for the good of society as a whole. This is most easily done in wartime. It then becomes a patriotic measure. The ideal war is the kind that results in conquests with light casualties. If such wars are not available, one must make do with what one has. Spain was such a case. Rome waged a long continuing war with her which lasted for generations. Whenever money got scarce as interest payments took money out of circulation, the Spanish War would be taken off the back burner and heated up. This provided the excuse to levy new taxes, the payment of which required private Roman citizens to borrow new money into existence from their friendly bankers. Problem wars. A problem occurred in 54 BC when Crassus, the great Roman financier, took an army into Syria to see if he could expand Roman holdings. In that day, a leader had to pay for the privilege of conquering a province. If he were victorious, he had a lease on his conquests for 5 years. That is, after the expenses of using the Roman army were met. Everything above the military expenses that could be milked from the conquered land belonged to the general. After 5 years of such exploitation, the province reverted to Rome. A man could get rich or he could become poor depending on how well his campaign went before the conquest, and how successful the tax collections were afterwards. Crassus was a good general, but he ran into a nation he couldn't handle. He and his army were destroyed by the Parthians. This involved Rome in never-ending wars with this nation. It was a running wound which helped bleed Rome of her manhood, but offered a perpetual excuse to borrow continuously more and more money into existence. Thus, the Romans' debts grew larger and larger, while more and more Roman boys marched away forever. Hermann, 16 BC to 21 AD. The second of the problems was that of the Germans led by Hermann. Hermann was a great German serving in the Roman army when he learned of the coming Roman invasion of his native German lands. Using the cloak of official business to travel extensively beyond the Rhine, he aroused the scattered German peoples who formed a confederation to fight the coming invasion. When Roman preparations were complete, the Roman legions wound their way across the Rhine into the forests of Germany. It was in the Teutoburg forest that Hermann and his warriors waited. When the time was right, the attack was made. The battle lasted 3 days. When it was over, the Roman legions had been annihilated. The monument to Hermann commemorating this great victory still stands at the site of this battle. The victory stiffened the Germans, and from that time onward they pressed against the empire whenever an opportunity arose. The Roman Peace, 25 BC to 175 AD. Rome found herself at war in Spain, Syria, and Germany. This was too much for Rome. The attempt to wind down the military adventures ushered in the period called the Roman Peace. This peace was not completely free from war, but it was quieter than the years preceding it. It also turned out to be the villain in the destruction of the Roman Empire. Peace or no peace, the Roman army still must be fed, housed, and armed. To do this, taxes were farmed out to the various provinces. The provinces, in turn, farmed them out to the various cities. The cities farmed them out to the individual citizens, industries, and farms which surrounded them. This meant that a certain tax was due on a certain date based on the amount of money needed by the empire, and it must be paid. There was no way out of it. The central government did not borrow money as a rule. This left the individual Roman citizen holding the bag. The average Roman had very little money, and so in order to pay these taxes, he was forced to borrow from private bankers. Borrowing 10 pieces of silver and having to repay 20 over a period of time became an impossibility, and so the farmers threw their hands up and abandoned their farms to their creditors. They weren't making enough to pay the interest on their debts, which they had incurred to pay taxes, and so they came to town and became part of the Roman mob. This was the origin of the Roman mob, debt-ridden and bankrupt Roman farmers. His farm was sold to a now debt-free immigrant for the remainder of the money owed on it. Roman welfare state. Welfare in a usury society is always destined to aid the welfare of the system, and only incidentally the welfare of the individual. Rome was no exception. The bankrupt Roman farmer arriving in town found 3 possible avenues open to him. He could join the Roman army, a relatively carefree life. There was freedom from responsibility, and certainly there was freedom from taxes. Of course, the soldier would be called on to build the Roman roads and fortifications and help with the maintenance of the walled cities. 2, there was always never-ending training and actual fighting required periodically in the life of a soldier. 2, he could go as a colonist to the new lands in Africa, Spain, or France, which were open to settlement. Unfortunately, the tax followed him to the new land, and often this made the new land unprofitable to work even before the plow had been put into the ground. 3, he could stay in Rome and go on the welfare lists. This allowed him to eat and also serve the needs of the state. As mentioned before, the overriding need of Rome in the peace phase was to increase the money supply. New conquests had stopped. There was no captured gold arriving to pay interest on debts. Most native Romans were deeply in debt and couldn't borrow new money into existence. New debt-free immigrants had taken over the borrowing function from the native Romans. A bankrupt man is a debt-free man, so the bankrupt Roman mob was placed on the welfare lists. The dole. With this government handout, the recipients could buy goods on credit worth many times the amount of the dole. As long as merchants received payments, both debtors and creditors were happy and the money credit supply expanded, benefiting everyone. Roman taxes. The dole helped the mob to increase the money supply. This was good, but the dole money had to come from somewhere, since the central government did not borrow. It came from increased taxes farmed out to the provinces. This made the taxes on surviving merchants and farmers heavier than before. At this stage, a number of things started happening. First, it was difficult to make money and pay taxes that men quit their businesses and joined the mob in Rome. Consequently, laws were passed prohibiting men from leaving their occupations. Declining birth rate. Next, since money was so hard to come by and expenses were so high, there was a great reluctance among the people to have children. By 65 AD, the usury contract had swept the heartland of Rome clear of Romans. Tombstones show that 90% of the population bore non-Roman names or had names that had been Romanized. Due also to voluntary childlessness, 400 families of senators under Nero, all trace is lost a generation later. There were more Romans in Gaul and North Africa than there were in Italy. Lack of money caused Rome to resort to force to collect tax levies. The imperial cities were assessed taxes, and the shortfall was made up by curialis, office holders in charge. In former days, this office was much sought after. After the imperial tax quota was filled, whatever was left over could be kept by these tax collectors. Now it was impossible to collect the needed tax quotas, much less hope for surplus taxes. Because of usury, there were 25 pieces of silver owed for each piece of silver in existence. To make good the shortfall of government taxes in these conditions was to seek ruin. If the curialis didn't have the required tax on due date, they had to borrow the needed tax money into existence themselves. Men refused to serve. Curialis had to be appointed. A commentator on this period in a complete quandary over how the 10 for 11 system works made the following comment. Yet there was still plenty of money about, and thanks to a highly developed banking system, loans were available at a rate of interest which rarely exceeded 6%. The writer obviously did not understand that at this time the Romans were so heavily in debt that it made absolutely no difference whether rates were 100% or 1%. The borrower would have equal difficulty in qualifying for a loan or having any chance whatsoever of repaying the loan if once obtained. The rich bought up land to form estates. As early as 367 BC, laws had to be passed limiting the acreage owned by the wealthy to 1250 acres. It had gotten so that there was none available for the small farmer. The Licinian law was passing requiring interest paid to be deducted from capital. This was the same as doing away with interest. None of these reform laws lasted long. In 326 BC, slavery and the death penalty for non-payment of debts was abolished. Everyone was becoming a slave. The remaining Roman and Greek farmers deserted the land en masse and moved to the cities. In 135 BC, Tiberius Gracchus, crossing the formerly rich and productive province of Etruria, had the impression that the land was empty. In 124 BC, he tried to distribute land in order to get the Roman mob back to their farms. He was killed in a riot. In 121 BC, his brother Gaius did the same and was assassinated. By 100 BC, there were only 2,000 land proprietors in all of Italy. Abolition of slavery. In the process of conquering the world, Rome brought in millions of slaves. Many were Greeks. Many were slaves sold to the Romans by their masters in other lands in payment for goods and taxes. These slaves living throughout Rome were, because of their slavery, denied the opportunity to become consumers and borrow money like the rest of the Roman population. As the decline of native population continued, the authorities were forced to free these slaves so that they could in turn borrow new money into existence. Slavery can never exist over a long period in a usurious society. The slaves are always free to borrow money. 11 free men can borrow more money than a master with 10 slaves. The system of usury itself decrees that slaves be freed so that they can do their part in borrowing money into existence. It was along about 200 AD that the slavery started to disappear. I have never encountered a case in history where slaves were freed en masse for humanitarian reasons. First, usury causes high prices, inflation, then heavy debts, a landless people, lower birth rates, and declining population, and finally, immigration of new peoples needed to borrow money into existence and pay taxes, or slaves are emancipated to achieve the same object. Thus, we have newly freed slaves in many cases receiving treatment and privileges which in former days would have been reserved to Roman citizens only. It is always so. A debt-free potential borrower is of far more value than a heavily indebted native citizen. The Roman financial community welcomed these freedmen with open arms and treated the debt-ridden native Roman with scorn. As an added source of revenue, Roman citizenship could be purchased for a reasonable sum. Nothing was denied them. Everything could be bought, if you had the money.